Claire Morrison stood in the doorway of her tiny studio apartment, one hand pressed against her swollen belly, the other clutching a crumpled note that read only 4 words, "I can't do this," and watched through tear-blurred eyes as the taillights of Marcus's car disappeared into the November rain, unaware that at that exact moment, 3,000 miles away, her estranged mother, a woman she hadn't spoken to in 12 years, had taken her last breath in a sprawling estate Claire never knew existed, leaving behind a fortune so vast it would take Claire's breath away, if only she knew. The apartment felt colder without him, though Marcus had been emotionally absent for months, his resentment growing like frost on glass ever since Claire told him about the pregnancy, ever since his business failed and his pride shattered, ever since he started looking at their humble life with disgust instead of the hope they once shared when they were young and foolish and believed love was enough. Claire slid down against the door, her hand protective over her 5-month bump, and let herself cry the kind of tears that come from a soul that's been holding on too tight for too long, thinking about her mother, Evelyn Morrison, the woman who'd walked out of her life when Claire was just 16. After a fight Claire could barely remember the details of. Now something about control, about expectations, about Claire wanting to choose her own path instead of the one her mother had designed. She hadn't known then that her mother was someone important, someone powerful. Evelyn had always been private, cold even, working constantly at jobs Claire never fully understood, living modestly in their small suburban home, never showing signs of the empire. She was quietly building in the shadows of multinational boardrooms and investment firms under a carefully constructed corporate identity. The next morning arrived gray and unforgiving, and Claire called in sick to her job at the community center, where she taught art to underprivileged children, a job that paid barely enough to cover rent but filled her heart in ways Marcus never understood, and she sat wrapped in a blanket that still smelled faintly of his cologne, wondering how she would do this alone, wondering if her baby would ask about their father, wondering if she was strong enough to be both parents. The knock on her door at 10:47 a.m. was sharp and professional, and when Claire opened it, she found a tall woman in an expensive charcoal suit with kind eyes and a leather briefcase, who introduced herself as Patricia Chen, attorney at law, and asked gently, "Are you Claire Morrison, daughter of Evelyn Sarah Morrison?" Claire's heart stuttered because she hadn't heard her mother's full name spoken aloud in over a decade, and she nodded slowly, gripping the doorframe as Patricia continued, "May I come in? I'm afraid I have some difficult news." They sat across from each other at Claire's thrift store coffee table, and Patricia explained with professional compassion that Evelyn had passed away 3 days ago from a sudden heart attack, that she'd been alone in her home office when it happened, that the funeral had been arranged according to Evelyn's wishes, private, small, already conducted. Claire felt a strange hollow grief for a woman she'd convinced herself she no longer cared about, a mother she'd imagined would always be there somewhere in the world, even if they never reconciled. "I'm sorry for your loss," Patricia said, and the words felt both genuine and rehearsed. And then she opened her briefcase and pulled out a folder so thick it seemed to contain an entire life. And she said something that made Claire wonder if she was hallucinating from grief and stress. "Your mother left specific instructions regarding her estate, and you are the sole beneficiary. Your mother's assets total approximately $5.2 billion. The room tilted, the walls breathing in and out, and Claire laughed a sharp, disbelieving sound that bordered on hysterical, because that was impossible. Her mother had been a woman who clipped coupons and bought store-brand cereal and drove a 10-year-old sedan. But Patricia was already spreading documents across the table, showing her portfolios and property deeds and corporate holdings, explaining that Evelyn Morrison had been the silent founder and primary shareholder of Chun Morrison Global Investments, that she'd built her wealth through genius-level financial strategy and an almost prophetic understanding of emerging markets, that she'd lived modestly by choice, channeling 90% of her wealth back into growth and charitable trusts. Trusts that now belonged to Claire. "There's more," Patricia said softly, pulling out a cream-colored envelope with Claire written in her mother's precise handwriting, and Claire's hands shook as she opened it, unfolding pages of words that her mother had written but never had the courage to speak. "My dearest Claire, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I've left you with a burden I pray you're strong enough to carry, not the money, though that too is heavy, but the truth. I left you when you were 16, not because I didn't love you, but because I loved you too much, and too poorly. I was building an empire I told myself was for you, for your future, but I was building a prison for both of us. When you said you wanted to be an artist, to work with children, to live a life of purpose instead of profit, I saw it as rejection of everything I'd sacrificed, and I was cruel. I said things no mother should say. I walked away before you could walk away from me. It was cowardice, dressed as pride. I've followed your life from a distance. I knew about your wedding, your work at the community center, and now, your pregnancy. Yes, Claire, I know about the baby. I have people who send me photos, updates. Not to invade your privacy, but because watching you from afar was the only way I could still be your mother. I see you've become everything I should have been, kind, generous, purposeful, rich in ways that matter. The money I'm leaving you isn't meant to change you. It's meant to amplify the good you already do. Use it as you see fit. Build something beautiful. And please, forgive a foolish old woman who realized too late that the only wealth worth having is love. And I died bankrupt in the currency that mattered most. You were always enough, Claire. I'm sorry I made you feel otherwise. Love beyond measure, Mom." Claire read the letter 3 times through streaming tears. Grief and anger and forgiveness swirling together like colors on a palette, and she thought about all the years they'd lost, all the conversations they'd never have, all the moments her mother would miss the birth of her grandchild, first steps, first words, and the unfairness of it felt like a weight on her chest. Patricia gave her space, stepping outside to make phone calls, and Claire sat alone with her inheritance and her memories and her baby doing little flutters against her ribs. And she realized that in the span of 24 hours, she'd lost everything and gained everything. And she had no idea which left her more terrified. The weeks that followed were surreal meetings with financial advisors and lawyers and accountants who treated her with deference she hadn't earned, explanations of portfolios and investments and charitable foundations that made her head spin. And through it all, Claire insisted on staying in her small apartment because she needed something familiar, while her entire reality reorganized itself around her. She didn't tell anyone about the inheritance at first, not her few close friends, not her co-workers, keeping it close like a secret that might disappear if spoken aloud. And she spent her evenings reading through boxes of documents Patricia had delivered, discovering that her mother had kept everything, every school art project Claire had ever made, every newspaper clipping mentioning her work at the community center, every photo, a chronology of love expressed through distance and silence. She was 7 months pregnant when Marcus showed up again, looking thinner and tired, with apologies tumbling from his mouth like loose change, saying he'd made a mistake. He'd been scared. He wanted to be a father, wanted to try again. And Claire stood in her doorway, their doorway, once with her hand on her belly and her heart surprisingly calm. And she saw him clearly for perhaps the first time. A man who loved comfort more than he loved her, whose affection was conditional on circumstances, who would be a fair-weather father at best. "I've been staying with my brother," Marcus said, running his hand through his unwashed hair, thinking about everything, about us, and Claire. "I want to come home." She noticed he didn't ask how she was managing, didn't ask if she needed anything, didn't seem to see her at all really, just the life he wanted back. And she said quietly, "This isn't your home anymore, Marcus." He blinked, surprised, because the Claire he'd left had been broken and weeping. And this Claire stood straight and sure, and he shifted tactics, reaching for her hand, saying, "Please, I love you. I love our baby. I was just overwhelmed, but I'm ready now." Claire gently pulled her hand back and said something she'd been practicing. "I forgive you for leaving, because holding on to anger would only hurt me and our child. But forgiving you doesn't mean taking you back. Those are different things. And I've learned I deserve someone who stays when things get hard, not someone who returns when it's convenient." Marcus's face cycled through confusion, hurt, and then something calculating, and he said, "You seem different. What's changed?" And Claire knew he was fishing, and she wondered if somehow he'd heard rumors, because money that vast doesn't stay secret long even when you try. She didn't answer his question, just said, "I've changed. Marcus Eve realized my worth, and it's not negotiable anymore." He left angry, and she watched him go with something like relief, and she thought about her mother's letter, about being rich in ways that matter, and she placed both hands on her belly and whispered promises to her unborn child about presence and unconditional love and breaking cycles of emotional absence. At 8 months pregnant, Claire made her first major decision about the inheritance. She established the Evelyn Morrison Foundation for Arts Education, endowed with $100 million, dedicated to bringing quality art programs to underprivileged communities, hiring her former colleagues from the community center to run it, creating something that would outlive her and honor both her passion and her mother's legacy. The press release went out on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday her phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters wanting interviews, people she hadn't spoken to in years suddenly reaching out, and Marcus showed up again that evening, this time with flowers and a rehearsed speech about how he'd always believed in her vision and wanted to be part of building something together. Claire stood in her apartment. She'd finally started looking at proper homes, places with nurseries and yards, and looked at this man she'd once loved enough to marry. This man who'd abandoned her at her most vulnerable, who'd returned only when he thought she had nothing, and now returned again with dollar signs in his eyes, and she felt nothing but a distant pity. "You saw the news," she said, not a question, and Marcus had the decency to look slightly ashamed before recovering, saying, "I saw that you're doing amazing things, and I want to support you, support our family." "Our family," Claire repeated softly. "Marcus, where were you when our family was just me, pregnant and alone, wondering how to pay for diapers? Where were you when our family had no value to you?" He stammered something about mistakes and growth, and she held up her hand, stopping him, and said with a clarity that came from her mother's letter and her own hard-won strength, "I release you from any obligation to this child or to me. I'll make sure you have legal visitation rights if you genuinely want to be a father, but I won't allow you back into our lives as a partner, and I won't apologize for having standards." She had her lawyer draw up papers offering Marcus a choice. He could be an active, consistent father with scheduled custody in zero financial obligation. Claire would provide everything the child needed, or he could relinquish his parental rights entirely, with a one-time settlement of $5 million, enough to restart his failed business and build a life, but no claim to her or the child ever again. Marcus took 3 days to decide, and he took the money, signing papers that made him legally a stranger to his own child, and Claire cried when Patricia told her, not because she wanted him back, but because her child deserved better than a father who could be bought out of parenthood. And she made a promise right then that she would be enough, that her love would be enough, that her child would never feel the absence of a parent the way she'd felt her mother's absence. She went into labor on a spring morning when the cherry blossoms were blooming in the park. She'd walked throughout her pregnancy, and she had Patricia and her closest friend Maya with her in the delivery room, and when they placed her daughter, her perfect, wailing, beautiful daughter, on her chest, Claire felt a love so fierce and consuming It rewrote her understanding of what it meant to be human. She named her Evelyn Grace Morrison, Evelyn for the grandmother who would have adored her, Grace for the second chance they'd all been given at love. And as she held her daughter close, Claire whispered, "You are loved, you are wanted, you are enough, exactly as you are," the words her own mother had failed to say, but had tried to write, the words Claire would spend a lifetime proving through action. The first year of Evelyn Grace's life was a blur of sleepless nights and first smiles, and the kind of exhausting joy Claire had never imagined. And she moved into a beautiful, but not ostentatious home, with room for her daughter to grow. And she ran the foundation with passionate precision, and she started painting again, something she hadn't done since before her marriage, filling her daughter's nursery with murals of dreams and possibilities. She thought about her mother often, talking to Evelyn Grace about the grandmother she'd never meet, telling stories that became less bitter and more bittersweet as time softened grief's sharp edges, understanding now through her own motherhood how you could love someone infinitely and still make terrible mistakes, how you could sacrifice everything for your child while sacrificing your relationship with them, how easy it was to confuse providing with presents. On Evelyn Grace's first birthday, Claire did something she'd been planning for months. She visited her mother's grave for the first time, bringing her daughter along, and she sat on the grass beside the simple headstone. Evelyn had requested nothing elaborate in. She talked to the woman who'd given her life twice, once at birth and once in death, telling her about the foundation and the lives being changed and the little girl who had her great-grandmother's determined chin, and she said out loud the words she'd been holding. "I forgive you, Mom, and I understand now, and I hope wherever you are, you've found peace." Evelyn Grace babbled happily and grabbed at dandelions, and Claire felt a lightness she hadn't known she'd been carrying. The weight of old resentment finally released, and she understood that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting or excusing, but about freeing yourself from the prison of perpetual hurt. She heard through mutual acquaintances that Marcus had indeed restarted his business and was engaged to someone new, and she felt genuinely happy for him, hoping he'd find whatever he was looking for, hoping he'd become the kind of man who could be present for this new person in ways he couldn't be for her. And she felt no jealousy, no regret, only gratitude that she'd been strong enough to choose herself and her daughter over the comfort of settling. The foundation grew beyond her wildest expectations, bringing art education to over 50,000 children in its first 3 years, and Claire became a quiet philanthropist, funding libraries and community centers and scholarships, using her mother's fortune to build the kind of world she wanted her daughter to inherit. And she taught Evelyn Grace, through example, more than words, that true wealth was measured in kindness given, lives touched, and love freely offered without expectation of return. On the 5th anniversary of her mother's death, Claire stood in the foundation's new headquarters, surrounded by artwork created by children who'd been told they had no talent, no future, no value. Children who'd been given materials and encouragement and space to dream. And she saw her mother's legacy and her own intertwined. 2 women who'd both been broken in their own ways, both trying to build something meaningful from the wreckage of their mistakes. And she finally understood that her inheritance wasn't the billions in her accounts. It was the lesson that it's never too late to change, to forgive, to choose love over pride, to become the person you needed when you were younger. That evening, she sat with 5-year-old Evelyn Grace, reading bedtime stories in their cozy home that felt rich with laughter and art and presence. And her daughter asked, with the innocent curiosity of childhood, "Mama, are we rich?" And Claire smiled, kissing her daughter's forehead, and said, "Yes, my love, we're very rich. We have each other. We have purpose. We have the ability to help others. And we have love that doesn't come with conditions or contracts. And that's the kind of wealth that nothing can ever take away." Years later, when Evelyn Grace was old enough to understand, Claire would tell her the whole story about the grandmother who loved from a distance, about the father who left, about the inheritance that changed everything and nothing, about the choices that define us more than our circumstances. And she would watch her daughter process it all with the emotional intelligence Claire had worked so hard to nurture. And Evelyn Grace would say something wise beyond her years, about how sometimes people have to lose everything to find what matters. And Claire would know she'd broken the cycle, that her daughter would grow up understanding her worth wasn't tied to money or achievements or anyone's approval, but was inherent, unshakable, a birthright no one could sign away. The inheritance had given Claire resources beyond measure, but the true gift was the clarity it brought, that Marcus had never deserved her, that her mother had always loved her, even through the silence, that she was stronger than she'd ever imagined, that forgiveness was powerful medicine, and that the greatest wealth was building a life of purpose and raising a child who knew, bone deep and certain, that they were loved without condition in the end. That was the only fortune worth passing on.